yards in Detroit. There were some African American soldiers. Very, very, very minimal. But the problem with this, and why Governor Blair denied it as a whole, is because the goal was not to enlist a regiment and raise a regiment for the state of Michigan to patrol the state of Michigan. A regiment was not going to do any good to the American Civil War, marching around Belleville, marching around Grand Rapids, marching around Detroit. It was going to do no good. The goal was to raise a regiment of volunteers and send them immediately off to the east when they were ready to go fight and end the war. So since that was not allowed on a federal level at that time, this is before the Emancipation Proclamation, to have African American soldiers fight in the federal army, they had to deny the request. But in 1863, after the Emancipation Proclamation was passed, you can imagine that Henry Barnes was at the front doorsteps of the governor's office saying, now is our opportunity, it's legally allowed, let me raise this regiment. And he does get permission. And on August 12, 1863, they begin the recruiting. The recruiting process has begun here in Michigan to raise their first regiment, and will end up being the only regiment of African American soldiers for the state. But while we talked about there being a need and there being a want for the enlistment of black soldiers, there's a demand for black soldiers. Black soldiers want to fight. The recruiting process at the beginning was very, very slow. It was immediately slow. One of the reasons was that a lot of these individuals are going to places like Ohio. They're going to Indiana. They were going to as far as Massachusetts. You hear about the famous 54th Massachusetts. There were Michigan men who went all the way out east to join this regiment. There's a couple of reasons why this is happening. The first one, of course, is that this regiment hadn't got started yet, so they could go other places where they were raising regiments. The second reason is there is a popular paper in Detroit that still exists today, named the Detroit Free Press. The Detroit Free Press was the Democratic paper at the time in the 1860s that did not favor the enlistment of African American soldiers and did not really favor ending slavery as a whole in the United States. So they are bashing, and you gotta remember too, Henry Barnes is the editor-in-chief of their opposing paper in Detroit, their competitor. So they hate this regiment with a passion, practically. They're the people working at this paper. Publishing in the paper that you don't want to join this regiment, it's going to be a scam, Henry Barnes is going to rip you off. But they're also telling the white community across the state of Michigan, because their paper has a reach way farther than Detroit, it goes across the state. And they're telling the white community members of Michigan to not encourage any such enlistment in this regiment. They're saying, don't encourage any enlistment in this regiment. Don't think that this is acceptable for our country. The blacks don't want to fight. They're not going to make good soldiers. They're going to get onto the field and they're going to run away. So they're bashing immediately, and newspapers are the biggest source of communication in the 1860s. They didn't have Facebook that you could just pull up and read all the drama going on. So no, they had the newspapers. That was where they had the front lines of communication. So that is a big deterrent effect. Another issue that they were having was there were no bounties for the men to start out with. A big push to help get you to join the regiment. You get some money in your pocket to start. So why join the regiment here in Michigan when you could go to Indiana and you can get a few more dollars in your pocket? And a lot of people who didn't have money, they're coming from the South, or there were also a lot of freedmen that really needed some extra money, so they could just go a little farther to Indiana to join those regiments. That became a problem, and particularly with the paper, because the paper was using that to capitalize, saying that, well, when he gets the bounties, when they finally get that money, he's not going to give it to you. Henry Barnes is a businessman, and he's going to rip you off. So that deterred a lot of them. Several of the local communities across the state of Michigan ended up putting up money, saying that if we all wanted to help this regiment get started, well, I could donate $3, you donate $3, and it all adds up to help get this regiment started. But the biggest thing, well, I guess the biggest thing is we'll talk about a couple slides, but the second biggest thing is the Enrollment Act of 1863. The Enrollment Act of 1863 is basically the draft in the United States. We've seen two bloody years of war, 1861 and 1862. Some of the bloodiest battles in American history, battles like Antietam, have now been fought. This is August. The Battle of Gettysburg happened in July of 1863. There is a need to refill the Union ranks. So they have this draft all across the country that does include white soldiers. But here in Michigan, they did something specific that they did in some states as well, but they did it here in Michigan, which was Section 13, which basically said for every white man that enlisted or that hired a black man to go in his place, a white man was removed from the state's draft quota. So what that meant was is if I was a wealthy businessman or I was a senator's son, regardless, if I had access to money and I got drafted, I was a white man, and I did not want to fight, I could pay an African American here in Michigan to go fight in my place, and I would be removed from the draft list. And they paid up to $500 to some of these black soldiers. That is huge, but what's the problem with that? $500. Blacks, regular Army enlistees, white soldiers, were paid $13 a month in the Army. Black soldiers were paid $10 a month. And then they actually took away another $3 a month, making it $7 a month. And then extra $3 that they took away were, quote, uniform expenses. You ever go to Las Vegas and they have those resort expenses that you don't know what it means, whatever? That was these uniform expenses that they deducted another $3, making it $7 a month they were only getting paid. And now someone's offering you $500 or $300, whatever it may be. It's a high amount of money a lot of times to go fight in your place. What was happening across the country is the black soldiers, they would get the $200, whatever it would be, they'd tuck it in their pocket, go enlist in the regiment, and once the regiment was off to a safe area, they ran away, just deserted. That was more money than they were going to make during the entire course of the war, and a little bit after. That was more money. So you were better off just running away. However, that does not happen with Michigan's regiment. And based off research, the reason why, they had a very, very low desertion rate. The reason being based off research is that they were stationed in places like South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. What happens if you run away? You look like this on the right. You run away in South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida.